Joining me now, Illinois Congressman Adam Kinzinger, who sits on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and it's good to have you here. I want you to listen to something Sarah Sanders said this week when she was asked about this concern that North Korea wasn't serious. Listen.
In the last 8 months, you haven't seen missile launches. You haven't seen you haven't seen the nuclear detonations. And again, these conversations are continuing to evolve. I'm not going to get into the details, but I can tell you that progress continues to be made.
Congressman, all of that's certainly very positive. This next step, though, after the summit in Singapore for Secretary Pompeo, is to try to figure out if the North Koreans will commit to something more and something verifiable, something I know you're very concerned about. Is that right?
Yeah, that's the key. So Mike Pompeo and I know him well. I sat next to him on committee for a number of years. He knows this stuff. He is the right guy for this mission. That said, Kim Jong-un has got to agree that this ultimately is in his interest to denuclearize. And I think up until a few months ago, when we had very strong potential military pressure, we had strong economic pressure, the president forced Kim Jong-un to the table. The concern now is that in this process of negotiating, that some of that pressure has been relieved, not intentionally, and we certainly haven't lifted sanctions, but kind of psychological pressure or pressure from China. I think, hopefully, and I'm pretty sure he will, Mike Pompeo's got to reiterate to Kim Jong-un that a military option is on the table, because the more serious the president is about a military option, the more likely we actually have a peaceful outcome. So I'm worried and concerned at the same time. This is all going to be judged not by like the valleys and the peaks of the day, but by when this is over, what is the result that we get.
And that trip is an overnight, the first time he's going to stay overnight in North Korea, and then he'll be back and he'll, I'm sure, inform all of us what he learned. Let me also take you to the next issue on the table this week for President Trump. He is going to head next week to Europe for the big NATO conference. I want to read to you something by Derek Chollet. He is a former Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs during the Obama administration, and he wrote this today in the Washington Post. It caught my eye. He said, "The odd truth is that when it comes to transatlantic security, the president actually has a pretty good story to tell. In the past 18 months, the United States and its NATO partners have continued to lift their game, bolstering their collective capabilities aligned against the Russian threat, increasing their defense resources, and developing new initiatives to address NATO's operational shortcomings." There's a lot to commend. And the president going into this meeting, though, after sending letters to all the countries saying, look, there's only 8 of you, 8 countries out of the 29 that are actually meeting their financial obligation. I think we have a list of those. It includes the UK, of which he was going to be in the UK as well. What do you think about this next step for NATO? And does the United States, do you in the Congress still feel that NATO is necessary and that Russia is a threat?
Yeah, NATO is absolutely essential. We actually get as much out of NATO as NATO gets out of us. It's basically a force multiplier. Prevents Russians from attacking our allies. Russia is still a massive threat. I think the president is absolutely correct in saying NATO has to meet its obligation, because and each individual country has to meet its obligation. There's some questions about how he's saying it, but you know, it's interesting. Yesterday, Fox ran this this great special on Ronald Reagan, and you see that when Ronald Reagan went to Europe, the Europeans were offended by him. They felt like he was too brash, like he was too kind of anti-Russian. And if you look at this administration, despite, I really wish President Trump would come out and say some bad things about Vladimir Putin, but if you look at the actions of the administration, you have over 100 dead mercenaries in Syria pushing back against them there. You have the sanctions that have gone and been enacted, not just by Congress, but by the administration, lethal weapons to Ukraine. The actions of this administration have actually been very hawkish against the Russians.
Can I get your other thoughts, though, on something that, you know, we can't see cyber threats, but as I understand it, the Russians are quite capable, and that NATO has upped its game there, and it sounds like that's a place where we could certainly cooperate.
Yeah, absolutely. The Estonians, for instance, had their own cyber attack. They've become very good at both defense and offense on that kind of thing. Cyber is really the issue that we need to be putting a lot more focus, because with the Russians or the Chinese or the North Koreans able to hit critical infrastructure, and there's a relatively low cost of entry to get into the cyber game. You don't have to have an F-35 to do damage. Right. You just have to have a really smart person on the other end of a computer. And I also think that Vladimir Putin needs to know, whether it's meddling in our election or anything else, that we're willing to do the same thing to him. There's nothing he fears more than his population turning against him. And I think we have to put those options on the table to say, if you come into our democracy, have no doubt we're going to come into your dictatorship and destabilize it as well.
All right, Congressman Adam Kinzinger, appreciate you coming on today.
Anytime.